Hello, everyone. I just recently got done reading this book. It is called Death in Florence by Paul Strathern, who is a respected academic. And he has written a number of books on the Renaissance period, on the Medici dynasty. And he has also written about Girolamo Savonarola. And since I just got done reading this book, I want to do basically a general analysis on the death of Savonarola, or really I should say the murder of Savonarola. He was killed by the institution of the Catholic Church in collaboration with the government of Florence. Many of the people living in Florence at the time loved Savonarola to the point that they were willing to actually physically fight for him on the streets. And at the same time, as is anything, there were many, many people who hated Savonarola. Many of the people who hated Savonarola belonged to an ideological faction called the Arrabbiati. Arrabbiati means the enraged ones. These were the angry people. And Savonarola was he was a monk who preached against Sodom. He preached against the corruption of the powerful. He preached against the abuse of the poor with all of the taxation that was being imposed upon the people in Florence, especially poor people. But he was also very critical of the Pope, Pope Alexander VI, Mr. Borgias. And he began to tell people publicly that Pope Alexander VI had a concubine, and this is absolutely true. Pope Alexander VI had many bastard children. One of them, Cesare Borgias, was very powerful and would end up being a pretty huge figure within I want to say the Vatican military. But Savonarola began to preach against the Pope. He began to expose the Pope. And one of the things also that he exposed, or that he talked about in regards to the corruption of the Pope, and really in general the corruption of the Vatican, was the crime of simony. Simony is the act of buying church positions. So I have a lot of money and I want my son to be a cardinal, and I pay you, let's say you're a pope or a cardinal, I pay you 30,000 florins to make my son a cardinal, and you do it. And they call it simony, but really this is just bribery. That's all it is. It's another way of saying bribery. It's ecclesiastical bribery. And Pope Alexander VI became pope because of simony. So Savonarola preached against the vices of the Vatican, the simony of the Vatican, and he was greatly hated for this. Savonarola then began to try to collaborate with several different European governments, especially the French government, to actually work to overturn or to overthrow the Pope. So Savonarola was trying to organize a revolution. He wanted to spark a revolution in the church to overthrow the Pope. And so Pope Alexander VI concluded that he needed to have Savonarola gotten rid of. And initially the orders from the Vatican were something like, hey, Mr. Savonarola, shut your mouth, stop preaching. Of course, Savonarola did not listen. And Alexander VI wanted Savonarola dead, eventually. He wanted the man killed. And Initially, the Pope, because the Pope, the Church could not kill. Right, this was one of the rules. The Church could not actually kill somebody directly, but when the Church wanted a particular person dead or executed, they would simply have that person removed from the Church and then given up to the secular authorities, who would then kill that person. So, you're the Pope, you want Savonarola dead, what do? You can't have him executed by the Vatican directly, but you can work with the Florentine government, the government of Florence, and say, well, this person's no longer a part of the physical church, and we're giving him up to you guys so you can do what you want with him. And that's what happened. Pope Alexander VI commissioned a bishop, Bishop Remolino, who was a Spanish bishop, to work on the case the case of determining or really finding a reason to have Savonarola killed. Because the Pope made up his mind. The Pope wanted this guy dead, and he told this bishop, go to Florence, Bishop Remolino, and basically find a reason why to kill this guy. Savonarola went through horrendous torture. And as I'm explaining all of this, I may go back to prior events because it's hard for me to remember all of this information. But he was horrendously tortured, and Savonarola went through a type of torture called the strappato. Strappato was a very, very excruciatingly painful method of torture, in which your hands were tied behind your back, and then a rope would pull you up from your wrists, so that you would be suspended up in the air, high above the ground. And then they would drop you, and you would begin to drop. And before you could hit the ground, they would stop the drop, boom, suddenly. And the force of the stop would dislocate your arms. And then they would have a trained medical professional present to pop your arms back into place. And then you would have to do that again. They would pull you up above the ground, drop you, stop the rope suddenly, boom. And then they would dislocate your arms again. And Savonarola, when he was a preacher, he talked about certain visions. He talked about how he made certain prophecies. He, for example, said that Lorenzo de' Medici was going to die, and die he did. And so a lot of people believe that he was a prophet. He prophesied the deaths of other people as well. And so they wanted him to confess himself as a false prophet. This was one of the goals of the inquisitors. The guy who was in charge of the torture, I think his name was Serseccione, and he was a sadistic master of torture. And the torture, the strappato, was so excruciatingly painful that Savonarola psychologically broke, and you can't blame him because it's very painful. And he said basically that he made up those visions and that he made up those prophecies and that he was essentially a false prophet. And this was exactly the confession that they wanted from Savonarola. So they wrote that confession down and they said, look, you see, he confessed that he's a false prophet. Only that the record is questionable because, for one, they also said that he confessed to have caused the food shortages that were happening in Florence. Florence had gone through a horrendous shortage in food. The reason for this was, there were two reasons actually. One was excessive rains that destroyed entire crops of wheat. And another was the war that went on between Florence and Pisa. And Pisa took a very important port that belonged to Florence and prevented food from entering the city, thus causing a major food shortage. That was the reason why Florence went through food shortages. But the record showing the supposed confessions of Savonarola say that Savonarola confessed to be behind the food shortage. Well, that's impossible. The investigation also concluded or reported that Savonarola confessed that he had never gone to confession. Well, that's also impossible because people who knew Savonarola very well testified that he, well, at least one person who was very close to Savonarola testified that he was very adamant about going to confession and confessing his sins. And I'm pretty certain that monks who were close to him, knew that he went to confession. So to say that, oh, he confessed that he was behind the food shortage. Oh, he also confessed that he wasn't confessing his sins to a priest. That's obviously a lie. So the investigation is questionable. The accusations made against him, like the whole narrative of him, the whole narrative trying to target him as a false prophet is very questionable. The investigation is questionable. The sincerity of the investigation is highly suspect. Nonetheless, Savonarola was forced to go back into his cell, and he stayed about a month in his cell. Then they got him out of his cell, and they began to torture him again because supposedly the confessions that they got from him in the first torture session were not sufficient. So they tortured him a second time, and before they could put him on the strapato, he had cried out that he was wrong to have said what he said in his prior confession, that he was like St. Peter denying Christ, that he truly did hear from God, that he truly did gain inspiration from God, and that when he denied getting that inspiration or getting or having those visions, he simply did that in fear. He simply did that because he was being tortured and he could not handle the pain any longer. Now, remember, in between the two torture sessions, he was in his prison cell, and while he was in his prison cell, Savonarola wrote a small book making his confessions out to God, kind of like King Solomon's Lamentations. And in this little book, he basically said, Saint Peter, who was with Christ, who had visions, Saint Peter denied Christ in a moment of weakness, in a moment of fear. Saint Peter himself denied Christ, and so he said, I, in my fear, in my torment, in my weakness, in my in me going through this excruciating pain, I broke and I denied the things that I received from God, and I basically said what they wanted me to say because I wanted them to stop torturing me. And so it's amazing, when you look at St. Peter received a vision seeing Moses and Elijah, and while he was with Christ, and he had these visions, and he saw the miracles, and he saw these things. He saw the miracles of Christ, and yet in fear he denied Christ. But yet God still forgave him, and yet God still wanted him to be the leader of his church, and yet God still loved Peter. Demonstrating that God always leaves room for humanity. And in our humanity, we have our weaknesses, we have our fears, we have all of our consternations. And so Savonarola said just this, that I was in weakness, and in weakness I denied that I had those visions. Yes, I said what you wanted me to say. He said, but now that you are torturing me again, I deserve what I am getting because of my weakness, because of the denial that I made. I deserve this punishment. And so he went through the torture again. And they put him back to his cell, and they concluded that he was going to die. The inquisitors, the government of Florence, they wanted this man dead. Bishop Remolino, who was commissioned by the Pope to basically make sure that Savonarola was going to be killed, he said, I think maybe we should spare this man's life. And the people who were running Florence at the time were all Arrabbiati. Florence at this time was dominated by the Arrabbiati. They were dominated by the anti-Savonarola faction. And that's another reason why, that's another reason to call this narrative into question, the official narrative, because the people, the commission that was in charge of his secular trial in Florence, the commission that was in charge of the secular investigation to punish Savonarola was dominated by people who hated him. They didn't even allow him to have a lawyer. And Bishop Remolino, who was sent by the Pope, comes out and says, I think we should spare this man's life. And the Arrabbiati said, no, he must die. Kill him. Kill this man for causing all this trouble in our city. And Bishop Remolino said, yes, I agree, kill him. And Remolino told a mob of Arrabbiati, we'll make a big fire to burn him. And the mob clapped their hands. And to reward Remolino for making sure that this man was going to be killed, the Arrabbiati sent him a prostitute. Before they sent the prostitute, they cut her hair short like a boy, and they dressed her up with boys' clothing, and they sent her to Bishop Remolino. These were some very, very sick people. Very, very sick and evil people. The authorities went into Savonarola's cell. They found him praying very calmly, and they said, you have been sentenced to death. Savonarola didn't say anything. He sat in prayer, quiet. Then the day of execution came. The day of execution came, and he never objected. He didn't make a speech. He just took his death. He allowed it to happen. He didn't resist. He didn't try to push back. And they brought this bishop over to make the declaration that he was no longer a part of the church. The declaration was given to this bishop by Pope Alexander VI, really showing that the killing of Savonarola is exactly what the Vatican had in mind. The bishop was trying to read the declaration, but he kept stuttering. He kept tripping over the words. Why? Probably because he felt guilty about what he was doing. Because this bishop was a supporter of Savonarola initially, but then he had to turn his back on him because the institution told him to. He read the declaration. He couldn't read. He couldn't really read it properly. He kept stuttering. He kept tripping on the words. So then he just looked at Savonarola and he says, I separate you from the church militant and from the church in heaven. And Savonarola said, you can only separate me from the first one, from the church militant, the church on earth, but you cannot separate me from the church in heaven. Meaning you can separate me from your corrupt institution, but you can't separate me from the church, the Jerusalem in heaven. And the bishop acknowledged the correction. They wanted to make sure that Savonarola suffered when he died. They wanted to make sure that it was not going to be a quick death. The executioner who hated Savonarola made sure that when they put the noose around his neck, that it was going to be a short rope. You make a long rope when you want to kill somebody quickly because the drop is so high that when you finally finish the drop, you know, the force is so great that it breaks her neck. With a short rope, you strangulate. You're strangled. You go through strangulation. So they had this short rope, and they put the noose around his neck, and they made sure to make the noose loose around his neck so that the strangulation would be prolonged. There were two other monks that were with him. There were two monks that were also going to be executed. These were his closest followers. They wrapped the noose around one of their necks, and they dropped the guy. And he was trying to call the name of Jesus as he was as he was being strangled by the noose. They got the second monk. They did the same thing. And then they got Savonarola. At this point, the two monks are still dying. They're still being strangled by the noose because they wanted a long death. They wanted a painful death. And they also wanted to make sure that as they were being strangled by the nooses, that they would stay alive long enough so that they could start a fire underneath them, and the fire would burn their flesh and they could feel their skin being cooked. So they wrap the noose around Savonarola's neck, they drop him, and he begins to choke to death. And there was a person who was supposed to start the fire underneath, but a member of the mob beat him to it, someone who hated Savonarola, and he started a fire underneath the three monks as they were hanging. And before he started the fire, he said, "Let me burn the one who wanted to burn me," because Savonarola wanted to purge Florence of Sodom. And the guy started the fire, and the fire was like an explosion. And it's a very sad story. When they were hanging, their hands were tied behind their backs, and the flames burned the rope that was tied around the wrists of Savonarola. And he was able to raise one of his arms up like this, and he clenched his fist in the midst of the flames. And there was a group of women that were watching, and they all broke down in tears when they saw that. It was almost like an angel was grabbing his hand. They died, obviously. Pope Alexander VI was jubilant. They scooped up their ashes into some wheelbarrows and dumped them into the river Arno. One person who oversaw the execution was overheard saying, "Now that he is dead, now that Savonarola is dead, we can go back to sodomizing each other." Bishop Remolino returned back to Rome, but he did not forget to bring with him the prostitute who was dressed up as a boy. Really goes to show you the state of the church in those days. It was decayed. It was corrupt. It was evil. Pure evil. And the way that the Pope tried to show that he was compassionate, "Oh, just bring him to Rome, blah, 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 blah." But behind the curtains, he was saying, "Kill this guy." Bishop Remolino said, "Oh, yes, we should spare him. Oh, yeah, I'll kill him. We'll make a big fire for him." And the way they wanted him to die, they didn't want to even give him a quick death. They gave this guy this painful death. They strangled him, and then they burned him as he was being strangled. After he was murdered, a friend of Savonarola, Sandro Botticelli, was still very hurt by what had happened to his friend. Botticelli was a famous artist in the Renaissance period. Sandro Botticelli also knew one of the Arrabbiati who oversaw the trial of Savonarola. And Botticelli went to this man's house, and he asked him, when you guys killed Savonarola, I mean, did you guys really have a reason to kill him? And this member of the Arrabbiati, who was there in the trial of Savonarola, he said, "Sandro Botticelli, we made it all up. We made up the charges. We wanted him dead. And the reason why we wanted him dead was because we knew that if we did not kill him, that his followers would eventually turn against us. So we killed him solely for the reason of saving our own skins." It's the same reason why Pope Alexander VI wanted Savonarola dead. Because Savonarola was exposing him, because Savonarola could have truly, truly caused the revolution in the Vatican. And is it not amazing that the very evils that Savonarola was trying to purge out of the church would be referenced by Martin Luther when justifying the Protestant Reformation. It is quite possible that if they had listened to Savonarola, and if they had made the reforms that he was demanding, that there would have been no Protestant Reformation. Which leads me to conclude that the church truly, truly deserved the Protestant Reformation. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.